American citizens continue to be held as hostages in an attempt to force unacceptable demands on our country.
Hello, and welcome to Carter's Crisis, the podcast where we discuss the issues that influenced the Iranian hostage crisis and assess the different ways in which these impacted President Carter and his administration. A lot had changed since that news broadcast on the 4th of November 1979. The hostage crisis was finally resolved with the release of the hostages on the 20th of January 1981, after 444 days in captivity. President Carter left office the same day, replaced by Republican President Ronald Reagan, who had defeated him by a landslide in the 1980 presidential election. The hostage crisis of 1979 ended almost 40 years of US-Iranian relations, spanning 8 different presidencies. In this episode, we will discuss this period, its events, and the influence these had on the deterioration of relations in 1979, before concluding on the impact of these events on President Carter. I'd like to welcome Holly, Iris, and Patryk to this episode of Carter's Crisis. How are you guys?
Yes, we're well. Thank you very much for having us today, Adam.
Not a problem. Operation Countenance was a joint Allied operation in which the Soviet Union and Great Britain intervened to overthrow the leader of the neutral imperial state of Iran. The invasion aimed to establish a supply line to the then besieged Soviet Union called the Persian Corridor, and also secure the Iranian oil fields owned by a British company. This was necessary as Iran's ruler, Reza Shah, was considered friendly to Nazi Germany and the oil vital to the Allied war effort. As a result, following the invasion, Reza Shah was forced to abdicate and went into exile, with his young son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi his replacement. The new Shah would go on to sign a tripartite treaty alliance with Britain and the Soviet Union in January 1942, agreeing to aid the alliance war effort in a non-military way, and later declare war on Germany in September 1943. He would go on to become a friend of the West, who adopted many tenets of westernization in his political revolution in the country, until his power was challenged for the first time in 1953. Patryk, what was the 1953 coup, and why was it so important?
Right, hi, okay. If we are to talk about the years preceding the revolution, I think it is absolutely vital that we start in 1953, and then we pursue the history of the Shah, Iran, America, and even the relations between the two countries in a chronological manner. So, why is it that we should start in this year? Well, there is actually one really simple answer to this, that being the 1953 coup d'etat essentially set out the foundation for the revolution of 1979. Now, existing discourse suggests that causes of the coup focus on oil disputes and Khomeinism with regards to Iran and Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the Prime Minister from 1951 to 53.
Holly, what does your research suggest?
So I agree with Patryk. Iranian oil became a central theme of the coup. Mossadegh called for an audit of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which was seen as majorly overstepping a boundary. Britain was extremely fearful that the oil industry would be nationalised, which would threaten their power base in the Middle East. Furthermore, Mossadegh himself was viewed as weak. He undeniably had some strange tendencies, so he would greet state leaders in his pyjamas, and he was quite prone to emotional outbursts, tears and fainting, which meant that his leadership was never taken particularly seriously. Finally, and in my opinion most importantly, in the Cold War world it was seen as imperative that Iran allied themselves with the West and not the Soviets. Due to Mossadegh's volatile personality, it was felt in the US that Iran was an unstable ally. There was some contentious debate in the US about this. Henry Grady, the US ambassador to Iran in the early 1950s, argued that the US should focus on improving relations with Mossadegh. Grady believed that if the West did not form a relationship with him, Iran would fall into the Soviet sphere of influence. Furthermore, although Grady did not accept the man himself, he pragmatically understood that many Iranians were devoted to him, and jeopardizing his rule would likely result in a long-term backlash against the US.
At this time, the US was fully embroiled in the Cold War and opposing the Soviet Union on multiple fronts. What impact did this have on their response?
So, the US was far too caught up in the trap of the Cold War to consider Grady's perspective. President Dwight Eisenhower's recently inaugurated administration were extremely fearful of the spread of communism. China had recently fallen to communism, and the US was heavily involved in the Korean War, so this view is somewhat obvious. In the case of Iran, which was one of the most important nations in the Middle East, the Communist Today party appeared to be increasingly active. Due to this, on the 4th of April 1953, the director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, approved $1 million to be used, and, I quote, in any way that would bring about the fall of Mossadegh.
To fulfill this, the CIA formulated a plan, codenamed TP Ajax, whereby Mossadegh would be forced to resign as a result of a military uprising. Patryk, how did this happen?
Well, I shall tell you. So, with the support of the Shah, who was Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the monarch of Iran, and surprisingly some senior clerics, the coup went ahead and was a two-staged affair. So the first attempt failed, which pushed the Shah to flee in panic to Baghdad, but his second attempt saw a vast demonstration ignite against Mossadegh, which actually forced him to quit. He was replaced by the ex-army general Fazlollah Zagheri. And within a matter of days, the Shah had actually returned to strengthen his power through a tighter autocratic regime. Now, the effects of this coup were detrimental. It planted a seed in the minds of Iranians who would, for the next 26 years, remember the events of the 19th of August as the Shah, rather mistakenly, made the day a national celebration. Whilst the idea was to make people proud of what they did, suggesting they proved their loyalty to the monarchy, it instead reminded people of how foreign powers continuously meddled with internal politics of Iran, strengthening a sense of anti-Americanism, which proved to be a large part of the revolution in 1979.
Thank you, Patryk. Whilst the Cold War dominated American thinking at the time, Iran was clearly seen as an important ally. Did thinking towards Iran change with different administrations?
Whilst there were variations in foreign policy under each president, the US administration was always geared towards assisting the Shah, which can be seen very obviously in Eisenhower, Kennedy and Nixon's presidencies. Eisenhower's foreign policy towards Iran continued to firmly support the Shah. Between 1953 and 1960, Iran became one of the largest benefactors of US economic support. It is thought that the decade following the coup, over $1.2 billion of aid was provided to the Shah. Furthermore, the CIA trained a generation of internal security officers in 1955 in order to maintain internal order. By 1957, Iran established SAVAK, which became an extremely oppressive security force, which tortured and murdered thousands of citizens up until the revolution of 1979. Kennedy was prepared to work with almost anyone in the Middle East who could further his goal of reducing Soviet influence and safeguarding US access to Iranian oil. The out-of-touch Shah shared Kennedy's fear of communism, which he often used to his advantage. In the autumn of 1961, a task force, which was focused on Iran, argued that preventing the Soviet invasion was an immediate and overriding objective, and Iranian stability was of paramount importance in the Gulf. Although Kennedy wanted to reduce the aid that the US provided to Iran in order to make Iran more self-sufficient, Kennedy and the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, continued to reassure the increasingly insecure Shah of the US's support in the event of an attack. The Shah was aware of Iran's importance to American interests in the region, therefore manipulated US policy by emphasizing a fear of communism in order to gain extra financial assistance and military support. Nixon, on the other hand, was a firm and unwavering advocate of the Shah. They had a long-standing personal relationship which dated back to 1953. Unlike Kennedy, however, Nixon was determined not to become involved in any other nation's wars. Instead, Nixon sought to make Iran the strongest country in the region, which he facilitated by lifting most of the arms restrictions which had been set by earlier governments. Military sales, therefore, increased from $94.4 million in 1969 to $2.55 billion in 1977. Overall, in the 26 years following the coup, the US almost unfalteringly supported the Shah's regime, even in spite of his oppressive mechanisms.
Thank you, Holly. President Carter became President of America in 1977, having defeated incumbent President Gerald R. Ford in the 1976 presidential election. Iris, how did his administration's policy towards Iran compare to the previously mentioned administrations?
So, in terms of foreign policy, the Carter administration essentially followed in the footsteps of previous administrations with a policy of continual support for the Shah, as they saw Iran as a real stronghold in the Middle East for American interests. So, similarly to the administration of the 1950s, the primary aim of the Carter cabinet was to support the Shah. As Holly mentioned earlier, in 1953, the coup was initiated by America to remove who they saw as an unstable ally in Mossadegh for someone who they deemed to be better at promoting American interests in the region. And the Carter administration had very similar ideas that the Shah was the best and most stable ally to further American interests in the region. And even as we'll see with the unrest of 1978 and the dissatisfaction in Iran with the Shah, the Carter administration almost blindly supported him with every decision that they made.
So, how did Carter advise the Shah to deal with civil unrest?
So, the Carter administration, the only thing they were really united behind was supporting the Shah, but there were significant differences on how best to do this. So, for instance, Secretary of State Cyrus Vance was a real advocate for pushing for further liberalisation in Iran. So if you look at your screen at the moment, you should see a primary source from the CIA. So this document, it's not entirely sure whether it was seen or not, or whether it was just a draft, but it points to the fact that arrest in Iran was partially a result of the Shah's social change and economic development, which angered many people in Iran as they were a very traditionally orientated society. So despite this, Carter and Vance just pushed for further liberalisation as a way to essentially satiate those who were unhappy with the Shah. And then you also have Zbigniew Brzezinski, who doesn't see further liberalisation as effective and was essentially pushing for military action in Iran to suppress unrest before it gained any more real traction. What's also interesting is, as Holly mentioned earlier, in the 1953 coup, the ambassador of Iran for America then was pushing for supporting Mossadegh. And Ambassador Sullivan, who was the Carter ambassador in Iran, was arguing that during the unrest, as opposed to just supporting the Shah, America should really be attempting to start a dialogue with the Ayatollah Khomeini. But this was essentially shut down by Brzezinski, who really strongly objected, even though you have this independent study by George Ball, who was part of the Kennedy government, and he was asked to do an independent study into the crisis, and his advice was essentially that America should advise the Shah to take a lesser role and avoid military action. So essentially you have all these different people in the administration disagreeing on how best to advise the Shah, which is just giving this mixed message and a bit of a lack of support to the Shah.
Thank you, Iris. As Carter himself admits, he had a split in his administration, especially where the Shah was concerned. He reflects on his own views on this in his memoirs, stating, "I continued, as other presidents had before me, to consider the Shah a strong ally. I appreciated his ability to maintain good relations with Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and his willingness to provide Israel with oil in spite of the Arab boycott. This explains well the priorities not only of his Iranian but also Middle Eastern policy." Carter stated in his acceptance speech that he aimed for peace in the Middle East, and moved to achieve this through the Camp David Accords, where he brokered negotiations between Egypt and Israel for the re-establishment of relations between the two countries. It is telling that even in stressing the importance of the Shah of Iran as an ally, this is partially attributed to his ability to act as a mediator. This demonstrates that although Carter saw the Middle East as an important region, his focus was mainly not on Iran, but its neighbours. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 would therefore force Carter to re-evaluate his policy in the region and refocus his efforts towards Iran. Whoever the US president was, it was clear that they had an ally in the Shah. Patryk, after his return from exile to absolute power in 1953, what policies did the Shah pursue?
Well, Adam, before I begin, I think it's absolutely important that I just reiterate what Iris had said, that being that the Carter administration blindly supported the Shah. Now, I just want to ask the listener to see if they could consider this question as they continue to listen to this podcast, that being, if they were to be in the position of President Jimmy Carter, would they have continued their support for the Shah, knowing exactly what was going on in Iran? So, now that we have this foundation set out and we understand, more or less, how it was that the Shah maintained his power, we can discuss his politics and his time in power before the revolution. Now, what is particularly negative about his approach to ruling Iran is that he essentially continued with the aims of his father. His father, Reza Shah, was a strict and repressive autocrat whose main aim was to eradicate the presence of Islam in Iran's politics, society and culture. Now, in other words, he sought to modernize Iran through the influence of Western ideals. Hence, when his son came to power, of course, without a shred of legality and legitimacy in the act, those aims were continued, and therefore so did their repression. Now, probably one of the biggest issues that we can confront here is his undisputed pursuit of military development. All throughout his time in power, the military remained as the top priority in terms of funding. So, for instance, by 1977, $7.3 million was dedicated to the military budget. Consequently, of course, with such a budget and such high spending going to the military, far less was being invested into the people. Now, to some extent, we can probably assume that the Shah was almost paranoid throughout his time in power. He recognised that the fact that the way he came back to power was illegitimate, and therefore he wished to ensure that there was no opposition that could challenge him. Now again, I'm going to reiterate a point that was mentioned earlier about SAVAK. So, in 1957, an intelligence agency was established with the support of the United States, obviously known as SAVAK. Now, this was a violent organisation that had the power to infiltrate all areas of public and private life, and more importantly, in the event where there appeared to be a threat to the government, SAVAK, as has been said, could resort to torture and execution to reduce it.
What were some of the major positive achievements of the Shah's time in power?
Well, despite the fact that the Shah's reign was, overall, an oppressive autocracy in which little to no attention was given to the people, there were some positives. So, for instance, one particular positive aspect was that the Shah made social reforms which gave women the right to vote. Women could finally run for elected positions in government, and more importantly, I think, is that changes were made within the family where men were restricted in terms of what they could do. So, for instance, the Family Protection Law of 1967 limited men's power in terms of divorce, the right to have multiple wives, and even child custody. And on top of this, The Literacy and Health Corps aided women by extending medical facilities and education to them, especially in regards to things like birth control. Now, these reforms were part of the Shah's White Revolution. However, industrial reforms, changes in agriculture, and also the distribution of land reinforced a complex and rigid class structure, which saw the rich enjoy great wealth whilst the poor suffered in horrible conditions. People were increasingly unhappy about these changes as they were deprived of work, pay, and housing. Now, discontent was increasingly widespread and growing on top of the issues already raised in the 1953 coup. Now, in the years leading up to the revolution, the Shah encountered issues abroad as the US sought to limit how much military gear could be bought to all but two nations, those being New Zealand and Israel. And on top of this, Jimmy Carter, as we already know, ascended to the position of president in America in 1977, and one of his major assets was his focus on humanitarianism. Whilst a positive force in America, this humanitarian attitude simply pressured the Shah into changing his policies in Iran. So, in an attempt to appease Carter's demands for better humanitarian policies, the Shah began to make adjustments. Savak's powers were limited and torture was reduced, and even in some instances, it stopped altogether. Those considered criminal were given the right to counsel before being imprisoned. Protests and demonstrations were not being suppressed by force. However, these changes were not concrete, and whilst in some cases the Shah loosened his rule, he soon found himself reinforcing policies to ensure the safety of it. Now, by this point, however, it became clear that a once invisible, almost impenetrable Shah saw the collapse of his defences, which gave way for the people of Iran and the likes of Khomeini to pursue more radical attempts at removing him from power. Thus, the revolution commenced.
Iris previously mentioned the beginning of civil unrest in Iran. Who opposed the Shah and how was this dealt with?
Well, as with any leader, there is always going to be opposition. I'm sure we can agree. The Shah, however, experienced opposition that was radical and consistent, opposition which acted and was always able to exploit its opportunities and lead to the collapse of the detested constitutional monarchy. We could argue that opposition arose for two reasons. The first, we could say, was emerging as a result of the 1953 coup, whereby it became clear that the Shah almost acted as a puppet to the West and pursued politics which slowly reduced and destroyed Iran's identity and culture. Now the second, emerging as a result of the Shah's policies and reforms, those which emerged during his White Revolution, and of course those which existed already with the introduction of the likes of Savak. Now policies which reduced the people's standards of life while the rich, including the royal family, continued to increase their wealth. Now, beyond the obvious, that being Ayatollah Khomeini, there were several other groups that posed a serious threat to the Shah. For instance, the Fedayeen-e-Khalq. This was the most popular leftist group in the 1970s, which was a violent group who took it upon themselves to assassinate certain officials to reduce the power of the government in Iran. Now, in some instances, even Americans fell victim to their attacks. However, because of the nature of their methods, Savak had to intensify their approach and therefore began to torture and execute its members. In this campaign, it is estimated that around 106 leftists were killed by the police. The result of this campaign on the party was that it became internally divided, so some wished to educate the people, others wished to continue with their violence, but either way, their effectiveness fell by the 1970s, but they still continued fair support from the population. Another equally aggressive group was the Mujahedin. Members sought to write and publish radical literature, and even bombed government buildings, but again, their influence was reduced by Savak. The important point to take away from this is the fact that the violent response of Savak simply added fuel to the claims of the people, who regarded Shah as an oppressive autocrat who shunned any real possibility of aiding his people. This simply intensified opposition and radicalized certain groups to ensure they continued opposing the regime in the hope that it would soon collapse. But the most influential points which motivated opposition was that the Shah continued to abide by the standards of the West. People feared the loss of Iranian identity and felt that soon, if Iran should remain on this path, Iran's culture would collapse and be replaced by Western ideals. This was seriously posed on a religious and cultural basis, hence the strong presence of anti-Americanism, which intensified against President Carter during the hostage crisis of 1979.
The problems in Iran led the country to revolution in 1978, culminating in the Shah's exile in January 1979. Patryk, how did the aforementioned civil unrest of previous years turn into outright revolution?
It's a brilliant question, Adam. Well, The revolution was a complex affair, and we can distinguish it as occurring in phases. The first phase encompassed the events preceding the seizure of the embassy, those being the protests, the demonstrations, and also the violent clashes between the state forces and the people. And the second phase, we could say, was the hostage crisis. So then, what actually happened? So thanks to the Shah's failure in making concrete and timely adjustments to his repressive measures following Carter's inauguration in 1977, the organised and peaceful protests of the people became more urgent and radical. So, on August 19th, 1978, a group of thugs barred the doors to Rex Cinema. They then covered it in oil and set it alight. Now, this was deliberate and led to the death of over 400 innocent Iranian citizens. The purpose of this act is still unknown today, which means that it is impossible to conclude as to who was really responsible. Now, some suggest that it was for the purpose of eliminating active political opposition and therefore possibly ordered by the Shah. Others claim it was done for the purpose of blaming the Shah to add fuel to the revolution. Either way, this was to be a critical moment in the revolution, as the events that followed led to the fall of the Shah. So following the fire, further demonstration ensued. The upheaval finally led to the Shah declaring martial law on the 8th of September, which then saw the protests be violently suppressed through military intervention. This day was to be known as Black Friday. Now, this event made it clear that it was in everyone's interest to push the Shah out, and therefore further protests occurred calling for the return of Khomeini, who was in France at this time. These protests threw the Shah into a state of panic as he turned to the United States, hoping they would do something, and even possibly along the lines of the 1953 coup, to keep him in power. The US had by now given their full attention to the matter, as they finally recognised the reality of the ensuing revolution. And I say finally, because CIA documents have highlighted that until it became too late, its staff was certain that Iran would not face a revolution.
What was it that eventually forced the Shah into exile?
Well, the last straw of the Shah's power lied in the support of the army, which received conflicting information and was being pressured by two parties, one being the US and the second being the members of the revolution. Now, in response, the military eventually declared neutrality, and the new government, led by Prime Minister Shah was forced to stand down. The Shah, once again, fled into exile before being admitted into the US for medical treatment. Khomeini finally had the opportunity to return to Iran following over a decade in exile and instantly sought to make changes. So with the provisional government, led by the moderate Mehdi Bazargan as Prime Minister, and the new Revolutionary Council in place, Khomeini began to purge the government to ensure it was compliant with his desires. And from February 1979, Iran opened its doors to a new chapter. And within a matter of months, Iran would officially become the Islamic Republic and face its first international problem, the seizure of the American embassy in Tehran.
As Iran had become such a close ally, the revolution was clearly significant for Americans. What was the impact of the revolution on US-Iranian relations?
So if we look from February 1979, essentially what Patryk is referring to as the first stage of the revolution, from that point, America had no real influence. This is essentially because of their policy of bullheaded support for the Shah and their failure to open any meaningful dialogue with the Ayatollah Khomeini, despite suggestions to do so. So America was left with virtually no influence in the region and essentially blind in terms of what was going on.
The Shah left power in the hands of his Regency Council and, as previously mentioned, Prime Minister Shahpour Bakhtiar and his cabinet were overthrown following a series of confrontations on the 11th of February 1979, and the country voted by national referendum to become an Islamic Republic on the 1st of April. Patryk, who now held power, and how did their politics differ to the Shah's?
Well, some of the points have already been mentioned in regards to the new government, but this is basically how it went. So the new government, which did replace, as has been said, Shahpour Bakhtiar, was internally divided between Prime Minister Mehdi Bazargan's moderate group and also Ayatollah Khomeini's more radical Islamic Council. So Mehdi Bazargan wished to establish greater democracy in Iran, and so, with the support of his followers, drafted a new constitution based on the French Fifth Republic. There was to be the referendum in April 1979, which obviously occurred, as Adam had said. to determine whether the people wanted the Islamic Republic, and Bazargan remained adamant that the people should have the option to vote for a democratic Islamic Republic. Now, Khomeini wished to impose a new style of government based on his Velayat Efaki, translated to guardianship of the Islamic jurist, which would diminish the presence of a democracy and pursue more nationalistic politics. And therefore, he was sceptical about introducing Bazargan's ideas and eventually refused to introduce them at all. The turnout of the referendum was quite extraordinary and was clearly in support of Khomeini, but nevertheless, what is important to consider is that Bazargan's democratic draft for the constitution could have been more popular, and there was a time in which Bazargan threatened to have the original draft released to the public. This could have weakened Khomeini in his pursuit of a fully Islamic republic, but had it not been for the hostage crisis in late 1979, which forced Bazargan to resign, he could have actually ascended to power in place of Khomeini. But of course, we know that didn't happen.
Thank you, Patryk. The revolution also led to a number of developments which would later prove crucial in the actual hostage crisis. Patryk, what were these and what were their impact?
The hostage crisis. So, with recent access to new material, including memoirs and interviews, the debate over the causes of the hostage crisis has expanded. Now, of course, this discourse is not limited to one idea, and many other arguments have arisen over the years. Some claim that the purpose for the seizure of the embassy was so that Khomeini could eradicate internal opposition, that being mainly Mehdi Bazargan, who opposed a number of his ideas and plans. Others also claim that the act was to diminish left-wing opposition, which was also true in some sense, but it wasn't really the main cause of the crisis, or the seizure of the embassy, really. Now, the most convincing argument is that the seizure of the embassy occurred as the students responsible, along with many others in Iran at the time, feared that the United States were about to enact another military coup that would return the Shah to the throne. Of course, this reflects 1953. The seizure of the embassy was to prevent this from happening, though there is no evidence that Carter and his administration were genuinely considering such a possibility, this being obviously the military coup. However, it is without a doubt that the event foiled any plans that were in development for Iran and its revolution.
Iris, how does this compare with your research?
I really do have to agree with Patryk here. I think one of the primary causes of the hostage crisis was the fact that not only the students, but many people in Iran really saw that the actions that the Carter administration took in 1979 resembled a rerun of 1953. So in the spring of 1979, you have America attempting to re-establish their embassy in Iran after a large portion were evacuated back in February once the Ayatollah Khomeini had returned. So in the eyes of the Iranian people, America is re-establishing a base in Iran. And then to add to that, you have the admittance of the Shah into the US. So again, I'm just going to show you another document quickly. So this one is a memo from Brzezinski to President Carter discussing the admittance of the Shah to the United States. So Brzezinski is very much in support of it. The interesting part is the fact that he writes that the response from Tehran is certain to be negative. The Americans completely understood that by them allowing the Shah into the US, the Iranians were going to have this suspicion in their mind because of 1953 that America again was attempting to essentially reimpose their ally.
Thank you. As mentioned previously, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, went into exile in January 1979. Patryk, do you think this decision was correct, and how did all parties view this?
Well, you see, Adam, this is an incredibly difficult question because right now we actually have the power of hindsight, so we can determine whether this decision of his was right or not because we know the events that precede it. Well, I guess to some extent I think it was wrong for him to do that. Because if you think about it, the idea for him was to maintain power, and it was very unlikely for him to do that if he was out of the country. Now, of course, it is really important to recognise that everything that was occurring in Iran at the time basically pushed the Shah out, and the likelihood of him gaining power was unlikely. But either way, him going into exile led to further issues between Iran and America, and of course it also led to the seizure of the embassy. So I guess, in my opinion, I would say that his decision to leave was wrong. But I am sure that you guys will disagree with me on this.
I would have to disagree. In the end, I believe the Shah had very little choice but to leave Iran. His basic choice was whether to spill more Iranian blood to keep himself in power against the will of his people, or leave and save face. In contrast with previous years, he chose the former, and this undoubtedly saved lives.
I'm going to have to agree with Adam here. I do really think that the Shah going into exile was the only choice that he had. And this was partly the fault of Carter and his administration, because they had blindly supported him through the entire thing. They were convinced that he was going to hold on to power, that there wasn't going to be a revolution. And had they advised him earlier to take a back seat and just remove himself slightly from power, then he wouldn't have had to go into exile. But because of the choices that the Shah and Carter's administration made, he had no other choice but to leave. There was no other option for him.
I agree. The decision to allow the Shah into the United States undoubtedly deepened existing divides between themselves and Iran, and those in power should have considered this more seriously before making a decision.
I completely agree with Adam and Iris here. The Shah had no choice but to step down. He not only was losing power and did not have any support of the people, which he had never had, but his health was failing as well. So he did not have the strength to lead the regime, which he had done for the past 26 years.
Thank you, Holly. As demonstrated, the Iranian Revolution had flipped politics in the country on its head. Iran had gone from purchasing the most advanced military technology available to openly outlawing America as a national enemy in a matter of weeks. Georgia, how did the American public view this development?
The American public saw their country faltering. The public perception of US-Iranian relations was both incomplete and centred around US interests. Given the other issues facing Americans at the time, for example oil shortages and a damaged economy, any further detriment to the Carter administration and their handling of Iran only plunged the Oval Office into further disrepair. As a consequence, when the turnaround came and America was portrayed as the enemy of Iran, the American public simply turned to their government to fix yet another issue, something we later saw as arguably unsuccessful.
Thank you for that, Georgia, and I look forward to hearing more about this in a later episode. To summarise this episode, the events discussed in today's podcast had a major impact on President Carter. As mentioned previously, events of the revolution highlighted an increasing divide within his administration, which would only widen throughout the remainder of his term. The Shah posed a thankless political dilemma. Any decision to withdraw support would be seen as an American weakness on the world stage in a period where the Soviet Union was aggressively exerting its influence in that region, and Iran itself through the well-organised and funded Communist Tudeh Party. Iran was also seen as vital to American influence in the region, and was an old ally, so any withdrawal of support would not reflect well domestically. However, Carter had information that the Shah was likely to fall 3 months before he was actually forced into exile, and made no concessions to mitigate the damage of a violent divorce. The anti-American statements of many taking part in the revolution made it clear that Iran would no longer be an American ally, but with the Iranian ambassador Sullivan and many advisors recommending Carter take steps to contact revolutionary leaders, Carter blindly stuck to his path and put all his eggs in the Shah's basket. This did much to alienate Ayatollah Khomeini and worsen the anti-American feeling in Iran. As a result, the revolution damaged President Carter. His backing of the Shah had failed, and some felt he should have militarily intervened to keep the Shah in power, as the Soviet Union would do a year later in Afghanistan. His middle-of-the-road policy made him seem weak, and this image would eventually damage him further when he fought a hardline Ronald Reagan in the 1980 presidential election. Thank you for joining us for our first episode of Carter's Crisis. I've been your host, Adam Tobin, and I hope to see you all next week.